This evening's seminar is held on the homelands of the Wurrung people of the Kulin Nation, and I would like to acknowledge them as the traditional owners and pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging, along with the elders of other communities who may be here tonight. Let me also give a very warm welcome to friends of the library, to members of the Grattan Institute and their supporters, and of course to tonight's speakers. From my side here, Francis Coppolillo, Professor Linda Kristjanson, Professor Peter Noonan, and Andrew Norton, who is going to be our host this evening. So we meet tonight for this discussion, which is very, very pertinent, a subject that's in play, you might say, once again, and that is about post-school options, both vocational and those to do with higher education. Now, just recently, ahead of the August COAG meeting, Prime Minister Morrison proclaimed that TAFE is as good as uni. Vocational education, he said, is as good as university. But it's interesting, isn't it? With enrolments in vocational courses continuing to decline, that confidence, I think we can say, is not necessarily shared by students. We are also hearing from many in the business community who say they want urgent action to revamp vocational education, to attract more young people into the trades and head off what they see as current and future skill shortages. Now, at the same time, we have university leaders who are calling for the reinstatement of demand-driven funding, which will let them enrol unlimited numbers of bachelor-degree students. So we have to ask ourselves, are these goals in tension? And what advice should we give to people, to young people, thinking about their post-school options, assuming, of course, they will listen to us. Now, to our panel. Leading tonight's discussion is Andrew Norton. Now, Andrew is known to many of us. He is the Higher Education Program Director at the Grattan Institute. He's the author or co-author of many articles. His pieces, I think, are always worth reading in The Australian, in fact, essential reading. His most recent report, though, is on the student choice between higher education and voc ed. In 2013, he was the co-author of a Government Commission review of the higher education demand-driven funding system. And Andrew, I gather this is going to be one of your last events as a member of Grattan, but we don't need to say farewell just yet. Okay. But Andrew is joined by Francis Coppolillo, Chief Executive of the Melbourne Polytechnic. Francis is just here next to me. By Professor Linda Kristjanson, Vice-Chancellor of Swinburne University, and Professor Peter Noonan, Professor of Tertiary Education Policy at the Mitchell Institute at Victoria University. So Andrew, I'll hand over to you now as host.
For decades, we've worried about this balance between vocational and higher education, and this has become more acute over time, that as the number of students going into university increases, the TAFE sector and the vocational sector has been concerned that it's not getting all the students that it needs. And so, as Maxine said, our final Grattan report was really looking at this choice between vocational and higher education for the lower ATAR students, say between 50 and 70. Admittedly using the limited metrics of employability and earnings, obviously not the only things that people want to get out of education. And we came to some quite mixed findings. What we found was that for young men at least, if they're willing to do construction, engineering, some business-related qualifications, they probably could earn more in a after vocational education than doing a bachelor degree. So for them, the usual story about bachelor degree on average earning more than the vocational qualifications may not be true. For women, we found a different story, which is that when they do go into engineering or construction, which is quite rare, often they don't earn very much and they leave and they go to other occupations which are more flexible but pay less. But in the courses they often do in university, like teaching and nursing, they have good employment outcomes, good earnings across the ATAR range. So we did find that we thought that for many young women, going to university, despite a low ATAR, probably is a pretty wise choice. But there are lots of complexities to this, and I think we can start unpacking them with this panel we've got tonight. The reason for the choice was that Linda is VC of a university that's a dual sector, so has both a TAFE and a university. Peter is a veteran of these policy issues going back many decades and trying to deal with the awkward relationship between vocational and higher education. And Francis is the CEO of Melbourne Polytechnic, which is a leading TAFE. And I'd like to start with you, Francis, which is that as the leader of a TAFE, do you feel like you are competing directly with higher education, or is it a case of you dealing with different markets?
I think it'd be simple to give you a simple yes and a simple no, and I don't think that's the situation. I think I don't think we're competing with universities. I think that as much education as our community can get, the better that is, both for individuals and for society in general. I think, though, that our major competition has come from the marketisation of the vet sector over the last number of years, and that's caused a fracture to our development, I would imagine. I think that we're also a higher education provider, and in that sense I also don't think we compete with universities because we don't get access to the same sorts of funding that universities do, although we're equally regulated in the same way. So I think there's room for vocational provision and vocationally orientated degrees as well, certificates through to degrees. I think government policy and funding structures have impeded us more than competition from the different sectors. I think we need more flexibility in the sector, however. We probably aren't as good both ways from a higher ed perspective and TAFEs in pathways and articulation in the way that we can, so that we're presenting to students a seamless continuum of education and flexible entry and exit points into work and back again. We see a number of students from universities come back in a kind of reverse articulation, if you like. And I think it's different also in different industries and what they require in terms of qualifications on entry and then as you progress through that industry.
Linda, could I ask you a similar question? You are a dual sector doing both vocational and higher education. Do you feel like they are competing with each other, or do you ever, does your organisation ever tell someone applying for one to go to the other or anything like that?
We don't think of this as a competition. We think of it as, well, I think a dual sector is the new black. I think it's a wonderful opportunity because it means that students can come with a range of backgrounds and a range of preparations, and our job is to help them match and fit where they're most interested. It was most evident at our open day recently, where we had our teachers and our academics in vocational and higher education meeting with people alongside each other, so that we can offer people a course either in a certificate but all the way through to a PhD.
Do the students understand the difference at Swinburne?
Yeah. We have the highest proportion of students who transfer from vocational to higher ed, and part of the reason why I think that works well is because it's seen as one university, one place. So students can come to Swinburne, they can begin, they can, if they have a lower ATAR or they may have experienced some educational disadvantage, they're not unintelligent, but they may have had some challenges during their childhood or in their adolescent life, we can give them a pathway, we can find them a doorway, and then they can take the steps in. The other thing that we're able to do, which I really am enthusiastic about, is helping students who may be doing a higher education qualification also pick up a vocational qualification and become more marketable. We have an example of one doing it right now who's doing her degree in psychology, but she's also picking up a certificate in mental health. And for her, that's a terrific opportunity. Gives her some very practical contextual learning while she's doing that degree. So rather than think of it as a pathway from one to the other in a more hierarchical way, we prefer to think of it as more of a matrix. Yeah.
So in this report that we did some work on schools, careers, education, and found that it was very patchy. Some schools do quite well, others offer very little. And the recent Joyce review of vocational education policy found that seemed to be significant confusion over even whether you needed to go to vocational or higher education for your given occupational goal. Do you believe this is a problem, that the schools just don't give sufficient advice?
I think it is difficult, and I think that there are efforts, particularly within Victoria, to try and create the story on a page so that career counsellors can be helped to know how to guide people and make that straightforward and simple. I think the other thing that is challenging is that the work of the future is changing, and the skills that are needed and the capabilities are needed are different. I think the days when people thought of vocational education as dangerous, dumb, and less important, I think are changing. And so therefore, I would challenge the views around a low ATAR means you ought to go into vet. If you're going to be working in some of these more challenging skills-based vocational areas, you need a lot of mathematics. You need to understand critical thinking and problem solving. So I think it's our responsibility as educators to work with the schools and the secondary schools to help them understand the pathways, the careers of the future, help the parents understand the careers of the future so that they can map in a less judgmental way the pathways for their child that suits them best. I would also add that we shouldn't only be thinking about high school leavers, Andrew. 30% of our students that are being educated in our pathway and vocational education division are over 30. And so as we think about the careers of the future, the roles that are going to be needed, it will be important to keep those doors open and invite people back in for further education, for another bite of learning that they can build in a way that stacks their learning and helps them to remain relevant and able to respond to the future of work.
So how do we deal with careers advice for the older people? Because we've got a captive audience at school, but how does it work for people already in work?
Well, we've already got a number of, I think, points of entry right now. We've had about 800 people that have come through for our vocational programs who are in the mature age categories that have been helped through the skills and job centres that the Victorian government has supported. So I think there can be some easy doorways. And I think the other is to really, it behooves us to get the message out about what those opportunities are, work with employers, and help employers know how to redirect people and help them to find ways for people to retrain and find new skills and opportunities.
I think the view that learning was linear and progression was linear in any industry has really been challenged. And so we've got to think much more flexibly as capabilities such as those that Linda was talking about become important at all levels of education. So whether it's in a Cert 3 or it's in a bachelor program or in a diploma, you have to grapple with those capabilities as much as you might grapple with more technical skills or knowledge that you need to undertake. So those things are becoming much more integrated, and they're integrated in the jobs as well. I think one of the challenges we do have also is parents. They are key influencers of young people, and also the experiences we have even as young adults or adults in the workplace. We gain our knowledge from our experience. And what the workplace of the future is showing us is that we haven't experienced what that is potentially going to be like. And so we need flexibility in education, both in terms of technical capability and knowledge sets that enable people to transfer a lot more. And that's quite challenging to grapple within a career education system in Victoria, which hasn't been well resourced in the past.
So Peter, you are doing a review of the Australian qualifications framework, and this is the rules that set out what the different qualifications are. Certificate 1 to 4, basically vocational education, diploma, a mix of higher ed and vocational education, bachelor above higher ed. Do you think the AQF maps neatly onto current work or future work? Or do we need hybrid qualifications? Like Linda was suggesting yes just a moment ago.
Because we're just about to submit our report, you understand a degree.
Be very careful, yes.
A degree of caution. Look,
No one will report anything
Yeah.
from this meeting.
yeah, of course not. Look, I think the short answer is probably no, because it tries to define at levels the attributes, the graduate attributes at a single level for a whole vast different range of qualifications. So one of the things we're looking at is how we can use it as a much more flexible instrument, rather than one would prescribe that graduates at this level will, regardless of whether they're doing a bachelor in physiotherapy or an arts degree in ancient Greek. At the moment, the graduate learning outcomes are defined in this ubiquitous sort of same way. So we're looking at how the AQF can better define and differentiate different qualification types, but also how it can be used far more flexibly then, rather than having all these levels kind of rigidly locked in a lockstep way. Look, hybrid qualifications in a sense can already be created. I mean, some universities, for example, I'm sure it happens at Swinburne, it does happen at VU, where you can have nested qualifications where people will get a vet qualification outcome while doing a degree. The problem is one of overlapping and dual regulation. So I know there are cases where, in order to create a hybrid qualification, you run the risk of being at variance with either the higher ed standards or the RTO or training package standards. And of course, funding rules can kick in as well. So, for example, Linda and I were talking about the example that she mentioned. It just coincidentally happened that I know a young woman who's in exactly set up the degree with a Cert 4 in mental health. And I asked her why she's doing it concurrently at the moment. And of course, it's because if she completes the degree, next year she'll be ineligible. So she couldn't do the certificate 4 end on, because it would then be a high level qualification. And of course, the other disincentive is that, and if it's on the free TAFE course list, that's fine. If it's not, she'll get a HEX loan. She could get a HEX loan for an additional higher ed qualification. She could be paying upfront fees for a vet or a TAFE qualification. So there's a whole range of regulatory and funding inconsistencies that don't work well from the point of view of flexible course design and flexible delivery. And one of the things at Mitchell Institute that we've been trying to do is to say that rather than saying the two systems should merge, we should think about making sure there's a differentiated and distinct set of offerings, but are better connected, and where there is there aren't anomalies and disincentives in terms of the choices that students make.
So that was a reference to you can't get public funding for a qualification higher than the one you've already done.
That's right. Yeah.
Could I hear? Does you have hybrid qualifications? How do they work?
Yeah, we do. Just as we described, in this way, we can, because we have the benefit of the range of offerings, we can nest a vocational qualification in higher ed, and we can also create those pathways for people who complete a pathway or a vocational program into higher ed. So that helps. It's not easy because of the funding arrangements. So when you made your opening remarks, Andrew, you spoke about, the students going into higher education and they're not going into vet, and the vet people would like more students. I think we should return to the why here. This is not about us trying to get more students. It's about the workforce we need of the future. And we're very concerned that we are seeing, if the policy settings stay as they are, that there will be a downturn in the next decade in the number of students completing both higher education and vocational qualifications, and a real workforce shortage. The reason more students came into higher education is they could get an income contingent loan. So if that's the doorway to go through, that's great. It was actually cheaper to come in and do a degree in nursing than it was to do a diploma. You would earn less, and you would have to pay more upfront fees for a diploma than a degree. So I think there are some real anomalies to the way the funding structure has created this disconnect. And that's the piece that needs to be smoothed out so that students can choose the right program for themselves and also have access to the right funding support. Because ultimately we are going to find ourselves with a growing number of young people who will be wanting to go to university or some form of tertiary education. We will have a capped environment. We will not have the funding support to help them get through the doors, and we will have a disenfranchised group in the next generation, and that creates a lot of social risk.
I'll come back to the funding issues in a moment. Francis, do you have this issue as well of trying to run hybrid courses and the funding system not supporting it, and you have to charge full fees for your higher education courses as well?
Look, I think everything that Linda said was reflected with us as well. There are a range of barriers, whether they be regulatory or funding basis, that makes that difficult. It makes staffing difficult across both sectors as well, under different awards, and those kinds of things become barriers. We work very hard in our higher education provision to ensure that that's quite practically focused, so working on knowledge and theory, of course, but also ensuring that that is applied, which is a mark of what we attempt to do, as a number of universities do as well. And then we would be providing almost skill sets that are above the degree if they can't be integrated within it.
So what was the background in deciding to go into higher education?
Well, the then Minister Lynn Koski created the idea of the vocational degree, where we would be able to develop degree programs in areas that were pathwaying from our vet provision and that were industry focused. And so that's how it began about 15 years ago.
Let's move on to the funding issues in more detail. So, Peter, the Mitchell Institute has done some work showing some significant declines in public funding over time for vocational education. Can you give us the background as to why this has happened and how big is it?
Well, it's substantial. And I do want to take a step back, because I was on the Bradley Review, which recommended the introduction of demand-driven funding in higher ed. But we made a very important statement and a recommendation. In fact, there's a very clear statement that there was a risk if demand-driven funding was introduced in higher ed. We warned of the risk of the states withdrawing funding in vet, and the discrepancies and anomalies we've talked about. And unfortunately, at the time, the government only adopted the demand-driven funding for higher ed and completely neglected the arguments around the broader tertiary funding. And then here we are 10 years later, looking at the problem that frankly was anticipated, so, which is very disappointing, because we're now in a much more constrained fiscal environment. So certainly income contingent loans is part of it. The per course subsidy rate, where states basically slashed the subsidy rate for a whole range of courses. The disaster with vet fee help, where again some states shifted publicly funded courses, not so much in Victoria, but some states just shifted publicly funded diplomas and advanced diplomas completely into vet fee help, allowed providers to charge outrageous fees, in some kinds triple the cost of delivery, and then of course we had the catastrophic meltdown. And that then left a problem, because the courses had been defunded. They weren't eligible necessarily for the vocational student loans program, so they're now, well, in some cases they had to be discontinued. And now that the caps have come on and we've only got modest population-driven increases in higher ed, we now have the perfect storm, because we've got limited capacity for higher education to grow, and on the Mitchell scenarios, significant anticipated ongoing declines in vet. And Linda's point is that in the next decade, when we need substantial growth in participation, you can argue about whether our scenarios are optimistic or pessimistic, but nobody said that they're not going to go down.
Yeah, we'll turn to that. So Francis, you've been sort of in the eye of the storm here. So when this funding disappears, how does an organisation like yours react? Do you cut the courses? Do you increase fees? How do you deal with this difficult, chaotic environment?
We've done all of those things, I think. We had diplomas go from $7 to $1.50
an hour.
An hour.
Yeah, for
an hour. Yes,
otherwise,
sorry,
it sounds very cheap. Yeah.
$1.50 an hour. And some of those were just simply unsustainable. We met some of the gap with price increases. Layered over the top of that were the eligibility rules, which further made it more difficult for people to actually come to TAFE. So it's been quite a complex system, and also one where it was really difficult with a completely unregulated, openly contestable market for the student to find the difference between a public provider and a high quality private provider and others who you might say were far less interested in the education more than they were interested in the public dollar that was available.
So how do you create brand in vocational education so that, like in higher ed, we haven't really had these problems because there are strong brands in the universities and students have a reasonable idea of who does what. How do you fix that in vocational? Because I know your organisation changed its name. Was that sort of part of the rebranding exercise? Or
it wasn't driven so much by the changes in vocational education funding and those sorts of things. For us, it was driven by the fact that we had higher education programs and vocational programs, and it was a way of describing the many different things that we do without our higher education staff actually saying, well, no, actually I do higher education in a TAFE college. So Melbourne Polytechnic was a way of describing the total and the continuum of provision that we offered. I think it was really interesting in the days of full-blown contestability. Most of the TAFEs, if you look around, dropped the name TAFE. So we have Kangan Institute, we've got Chisholm Institute, we've got a whole range of institutes, but not so many TAFEs. Of late, that's changed. I think TAFE as a public provider and the ability to use the word public provider has come back into the discourse. It certainly was not the case. So we struggled very much to differentiate ourselves from an open marketplace.
Look, are we now at a point that the private sector has been tarnished? Because even though it was a relatively small number involved in the vet fee help scandal, people don't know who's what. Is that shifted the market?
It's interesting with the private-public thing. I think private providers have been in the system for an extremely long period of time. I think what happened was that the policy settings and the funding arrangements brought in an influx of providers that really did not have a history. They created themselves in the policy and funding landscape. They actually were not education providers. So if you think about the creative arts, for instance, they've always been very good, quite focused private providers in that space, and they've coexisted, and enterprise-based vocational training providers. What the funding settings did is just open the floodgates, which made it incredibly difficult for anyone who was trying to deliver a quality provision to students to continue to do that.
Linda, what's your experience of this?
Pretty personal, actually. It was tough. We had, a real downturn with funding cuts in Victoria in 2012, and we had to find $40 million out of the business right away. So that led to redundancies, and we had to reshape our courses and really think about what it was we would offer. So we did that in alignment with our university vision, which was to be a leading university of science, technology, and innovation. And we moved out of areas that did not align specifically with that. That could allow us to really create some clearer pathways between vocational and higher education. I think what was particularly concerning at that time was the opening up to a range of providers without the right protections in place. And I remember saying to the minister of the day that if you want to control quality, minister, control your providers. Don't chase it later. And ASQA was meant to be the regulator that was going to protect, but really ASQA had no teeth, and it was quite difficult. And so students were captured by a lot of marketing by some providers who weren't in the education business on Monday, but they were on Wednesday. And they were offering, free laptops or iPads come along. And so students, were drawn into this because they wouldn't necessarily have had the background to screen for reputation in the way that you described with a university name. And then they squandered their entitlements when this didn't work out. So to me, it was really quite heartbreaking and really not ethical in many instances. So I think that we've had some correction now. We are seeing more of the vocational students coming back to the university, and I think it's because we've been here for over 110 years, and they know we're going to be there in 110 years, and so they know that their qualification means something when they get their vocational qualification from us and from reputable TAFE providers that they've known and trusted. So I think there has been damage in the past. I think it's being corrected. And I do think that the free TAFE initiative, and I know you want to talk about that later, but it does connect to this point, Andrew, because the free TAFE initiative has, I think, brought pride back to vocational education, and you've seen a return of students who are finding their way through that doorway now, and I think that has spilled over to the vocational area more broadly, which is a positive thing.
Peter?
I'd probably, just in terms of brand and student choice and background, I think the missing piece in the discussion is vocational programs for senior secondary students, and I put it deliberately that way rather than vetting schools, because it seems to me that vetting schools is vocational provision in the average senior secondary school, the average high school, is an extremely difficult thing with all the goodwill in the world, for most schools to do at the breadth and depth and quality that's required, and particularly in terms of the teachers and trainers, thinking particularly about apprenticeship in areas where, frankly, young people need to be working with and mentored by industry practitioners with deep experience. So I'm completely sceptical, because I've just been through too many marketing campaigns saying let's build the image of vet. We know that social marketing campaigns don't work, because it's very hard to change entrenched social and cultural attitudes through marketing alone. It really gets changed through experience. I don't know why young people, if they are entitled to access the schooling resources package, the funding that flows to schools, why they shouldn't be entitled to carry that funding to complete a senior secondary education at a TAFE institute, possibly in partnership with a school. I'm not arguing for the reintroduction of technical schools as they were. And of course there are technical centres at Holmesglen and I think at Melbourne Poly, but they're not widespread. It's certainly a problem in regional areas. And I think if you could do one thing to provide a much better understanding and experience of the range of vet offerings and the opportunities that come out of it, it would be to enable young people at an earlier age to participate, become immersed, to experience it, and then to go through logically through a pathway directly into TAFE. And in many cases I would go with credit. But at the moment that is not the case often with the way vet is schooled, is structured and delivered and offered. And the thing that particularly incenses and outrages me is when you see the continuing practice of schools, despite constant guidelines and statements from the department, from the minister about charging, to see working class kids being charged fees to do vet units because, quote, we're not funded for those, we're funded to do the academic programs. So you'll find that kids are often forking out, or their parents forking out, sometimes thousands of dollars to do vetting schools units, when in fact the schooling resources package is meant to cover the total provision of all senior secondary subjects, including vet ones. So I think the vetting schools and vet for senior secondary students area is the one that requires the most fundamental rethinking of all of the policy areas. I think that's the one that is the most important area to start.
So is there a problem with encouraging people to finish year 12, which makes the school the owner of these students when they should be allowed to leave and
absolutely.
do their apprenticeship?
I mean, the incentive with the way that funding works is the incentive is to retain kids. And I'm not saying it's easy, because of course a lot of young people will want to complete senior secondary with the cohort of students they started with. They'll want to go to graduation balls and all of those things, school sports. I'm not saying it's easy, but for a whole range of students, particularly ones who aren't achieving at school, who aren't happy, who need to be in a different environment, often I think an adult learning environment. To be frank, for a lot of young men, I suspect it would probably be actually working with older men in the trades and things like that, if I can sound a bit gendered to say it, but I think it's actually the reality out there, particularly in some of the outer metropolitan suburbs and regional areas. And even if it's not where they end up with a successful experience, at least they've got an experience of a different world and a different way of learning than the one that they've probably failed in over many years. So I'm not arguing that we need to, as I say, introduce a sort of a dual system with bringing back the old tech schools. I think that's far too simple. But if you look at the richness of what's available for senior secondary students in TAFE and in the VET system, why they can't be exposed to it earlier and properly resourced and funded to do it is a mystery to me.
Frances, do you want to?
Look, I agree with Peter. I think we should be providing young people in schools a lot more flexibility than we do. The courses are there for that to happen. They should be able to finish off with their friends and go to their, graduating balls, etc., but also be able to complete a VET qualification or units out of a bachelor program, if that's what it is that they want to do. I think the more diverse the offering, the more it's going to reflect the needs of young people. I think we try and either put them into one pathway or another as though they're the only two pathways that are possible. And in fact, what we know from young people is that they want a lot more diversity in the options that are offered to them. And so I think it is around trying to hang on to territories that becomes the difficulty. And it's not as though VET in schools funding hasn't tried to be addressed a significant number of times, and we just haven't been able to crack that one.
Could I go into this free TAFE? Has this had a big impact on demand? And if it has, does that signal that the fees were a major issue in the market? Frances?
Look, what we're seeing at the moment is we've seen certainly an increase in enrolments through free TAFE. It's been a very positive thing. It's great to see the return of a lot of students back into TAFE and having very vibrant campuses. Particularly in particular areas. We've seen increases in cybersecurity, community services, horticulture, a whole range of areas. And I think it's been a very positive thing. I think fees is an issue where someone may not think that they can also study as well as other financial pressures that they have. Free TAFE's been an opportunity to address that financially, and I think in certain parts of Victoria that's even more so than others. And I think that's been a very positive thing.
Yeah, I would agree. I think it's been very positive. We've seen the same response in terms of healthcare, community care, building construction, cybersecurity, accounting, bookkeeping. So people are wanting to find their way to an educational experience that will give them a job. And I think that it is signalling that the fees were a deterrent, particularly to some individuals who would be the first in family to ever consider tertiary education. And so this really does start to look much more accessible. What we have done, though, is we have also counselled students, and sometimes they will say, well, in actual fact, the course I want to take isn't the one that's free, but I'm here now, and it's opened my eyes to what else is on the menu. And they might say, well, I want to do this one, but later I'd reserve my right to do one of the free courses later. What we have learned, and we had very little preparation for this, so we had to move quite quickly, is that, as you would imagine, these courses all require some form of placement or practice experience. And so because we were able, through our university resources, to dedicate infrastructure support to locating places for these individuals, we've been able to meet the expectations. But that's a key component. The other one that we've wondered about, and we're not clear yet, is whether attrition will be higher. because students don't have the same investment because it's free. So what we've done is respond with more what we call hypercare to make sure that we are really giving students as much support as possible to keep them enrolled, because we would not want this to become a failure or a disappointment in their educational history. So we're working quite actively to make sure that this is successful. But as I said earlier, I think that the overall halo effect of pride and enthusiasm for vocational courses and respect for vocational courses that will lead to jobs that we desperately need filled, I think has been the major takeaway that we want to reinforce.
There was quite a good television ad campaign as well for it, I think, which probably helped.
So, Andrew, I was just going to say the relationship between free and retention was something that we also really worried about as a sector, because the experience overseas, particularly in New Zealand, was that the attrition rate was at 30%. And so what we've found is that the attrition rate is no different to any other TAFE student at our place, and I think that's been borne out by and large across the sector, albeit there has been additional effort gone in. But it certainly hasn't been borne out that there's been a greater attrition because it's free versus paid for.
What about the courses where there are still fees? Has demand for them gone down? And to what extent? So we've got trade support loans, which can help some people doing apprenticeships, and we've got vet student loans, which apply to some diploma courses. What about the other students? How do they
So
manage?
are you asking a question of cannibalisation between one
Partly,
area and
and
another?
also just the practicalities of it. How do students manage when they're left with an upfront charge?
Well, different institutes will have a range of arrangements that will support students to undertake a course of study. There are loan systems or partial payments, those kinds of things that are available. As you say, the vet fee help is only available at certain levels of the vocational programming, but there'll be part loans and direct debit and those kinds of things available to students.
Andrew, I think just hark back, I suppose, to the work we've done at Mitchell Institute over the last several years, and we'll be continuing on with as part of the ongoing work program, which is really two parts to it. One is the overall issue of participation. So if we do merely see substitution between free and fee paying, the overall effect on participation might be minimal, because in effect some students will be in free courses and there may just be a substitution effect, and that was certainly an issue I know with New Zealand. I think, without sounding too much like an economic rationalist,
Go ahead.
There's one or two of those in the room already. I think you always have to ask yourself the question: if you've got $300, $400, $500, $600 million to spend, and your objective is to actually maximise participation and outcomes retention, what's the best way to spend it? I certainly think we need to look at the whole income contingent loan area, and so in New Zealand they are available across the tertiary system, but the repayment thresholds are much lower. So when the thresholds were being lowered in higher education, some people opposed it strongly on equity grounds, but it certainly got on my ire, because the same people who would be concerned about the effect of dropping the thresholds for higher ed students had almost no interest at all in the fact that the vast majority of vet students were paying up front. And it seemed to me a reasonable trade-off to say that if you could drop the threshold so everybody could get an income contingent loan and then pay it back at relatively low rates, that to me is a more equitable system than one where only some students in higher education can get an income contingent loan. And it also basically means that the whole vet fee help project failed. It should have been focused on the subsidised courses, particularly at quality providers like TAFE, so it could operate like HECS does with universities, rather than creating a full fee market. So again, in the Mitchell submission to the Vet Fee Help Review, we argued that it should be refocused on, matched in with the state subsidy system as part of a rethinking of tertiary education overall, so that in fact at the point of entry for all tertiary students, or certainly most full-time young people, it's free at the point of entry. I think that's the critical objective.
I'm going to move to audience questions soon, so get ready. I just want to keep going with you, Peter, on your work on participation and attainment. So you put out a report a number of months ago which had some frightening projections. Can you explain why this could look ugly by the mid-2020s?
So all we did was we mapped the continuation of the demand-driven system based on the trend that had pertained over the previous 2 years. We mapped the effect of the funding freeze on enrolments, and we mapped the effect of the trend in vet enrolments over the previous 2 years and extrapolated that over 10 years. Now, you could argue about whether they're plausible scenarios or not. What we then did was basically looked at the enrolments as a proportion of the population. Now, the reason why the participation rates fall, particularly in vet, is that we've got substantial population growth. So if you've got declining enrolments, if you've got static enrolments in higher ed and growing population, then higher ed participation will drop marginally over time. If you've got significant declines in vet enrolments and population growth, then you've got the perfect storm, and that's why the vet participation scenario falls off the cliff. Now, we're accused of being alarmist or these are unrealistic and so on, in which case I would say to the people who would make that criticism, particularly people in government, well, tell me the policy intervention that's going to stop the trend going down, particularly when we look at the vet government-funded student data again for last year, because it continues to decline. So when we update that graph, it'll continue to go down. Whether it goes as far as we projected or not, I'm not sure. And that's why it's really good that the whole issue is back on the COAG agenda. But basically, the nation needs to take stock of the fact that investment in tertiary education overall, but particularly in vocational education, is actually stagnant and declining, and as is participation in enrolment, as Linda said, just at a time when the population's increasing and the existing workforce is going to have to support more people who aren't in the workforce. So it's not a choice that the country can afford to take lightly.
Yeah, so just in the school leaver demographic, there'll be 50,000 more 19-year-olds 10 years from now than there are today. So that's, for unis alone, that's probably worth about 20,000 extra commences every year, and probably similar numbers again in vocational education with a system that's in decline. So Linda, putting on your higher ed hat, things haven't been nearly as bad for you wearing that hat as wearing your TAFE hat, but we're now in our second year of declining real funding of higher education. What impact is that going to have on your capacity to deliver student places over time?
It is a challenge. It is a constraint. And it's a conversation that all of the vice chancellors, I think, are having with our ministers in different parts of the country, as well as our federal minister, to really foreshadow the risks that are emerging for the Australian community. I just locate this in concerns about our future workforce. We talk about knowledge economy, we talk about Industry 4.0 and the jobs of the future that are going to require increased qualifications, both in vet and higher ed. And if we settle on these kind of locked-in frameworks for higher education in a capped environment, we are just simply not going to be able to take in students, and we're not going to be producing the graduates that are needed. We've got the baby boomers coming along, the Costello-Howard baby boomers, and so there's going to be an increased demand, and yet the places will not be there. Universities have been criticized for recruiting international students, but if you're capped at domestic students and you don't have any funding support for vocational students or an income contingent loan scheme that would encourage them to participate more fully, then that becomes your only lever. And that balance is one that has to be very carefully managed. Our own university is probably about 80%, 83% domestic students, so we really are a work engine for the domestic workforce. But you can bring in some more international students, and you need to spread the risk around that. But if you get too far with the imbalance between domestic and international students, you're changing the nature of the Australian educational experience. So that one is not a good medium-term solution. So I think it means engaging actively with the wider community, with the business community, to help think about how we can influence policy settings to really demonstrate, as other countries are doing, that investment in education is an investment in our future.
So would you prefer the demand-driven system to return? Is that your goal?
Yep. Yeah, I think so. And contrary to Maxine's opening comments about, uncapped going on forever, when you really looked at the data over the period of time when we had an uncapped market, it was not unfettered and out of control enrollments. Universities do care about their brand. They do care deeply about quality. And we wanted to be able to attract students into a range of programs. What we want is, and this is where I think building on the AQF review is going to be very helpful, to look then at the COAG conversation and ways in which we could build a more seamless and connected tertiary system, which would give us the freedom and flexibility to help attract students to the right course for them at the right time. But if the only door that was open was uncapped and nothing in vet, then that was where the students went. Right? So I do think we really need to look at that uncapped market again. I know it may seem like a difficult one to imagine, but I do think that we're going to have a much more assertive approach to growing places for our domestic students.
I did check and found that most of these young people are in Liberal health seats, so maybe that will change the calculation. Okay, it's time for audience questions. I do have some that were submitted prior, but is there anyone in the audience who's got a question? It can be to the whole panel or to someone in particular. There's one over here. So we've got microphones here.
Thank you. My name's Lynn Oak. I find it extraordinary that the federal government doesn't take some role in determining what tertiary vocational courses are offered. I work in the health field, and there are various health professions that are desperately needed, and yet there aren't training places for enough students, and yet there are other health professions that the associations are trying to caution and say you don't need any more of this particular health profession being churned out because there aren't places for the students. But the universities are opting for, I think, the cheaper course to run. The ones that are more costly because of equipment related to the aspect of the work are the ones that aren't offered. Do you think that that there should be some coordination and direction provided in this area?
Well, so again, in the Bradley review recommendations, there was a recommendation, or certainly a point that was made, that in cases of clear what we call market failure, of egregious oversupply, or where there were serious shortages, that it was a legitimate role for government in the public interest to step in and help shape provision. Now, having said that, I think Andrew and I both would share a similar scepticism about the ability often for government to get this right. And having run a central planning and purchasing system in a state vet system, I'm not a fan of those models because they often end up you end up with serious lag effects. The intelligence you use is often state or national in character, so it doesn't reflect regional or local needs, and you can get the awful effect of winner picking, where subsidy rates get increased or decreased to try and influence what institutions do, but in fact it's actually student demand that drives provision rather than what courses universities usually put on. So if there's an area of serious undersupply, usually you've got to look at the more fundamental reasons why that's a factor, and it's often due to wages and conditions, labour market factors, the way the occupation's structured, a whole range of complex things rather than simply the course that the institution puts on.
Yeah, so people in the room who've heard me before will say, know that I'm very concerned about the way the government promoted science courses, for example, over the last decade, which was a successful campaign that enrolments boomed, but now we've got very, very poor outcomes, particularly people in the biological sciences, where there just aren't nearly enough jobs relevant to their skills. On the other hand, the demand-driven system did see the biggest absolute increases in the health fields, which were the main areas of skill shortage prior to the demand-driven system. And even though there are bottlenecks in the health training system because of the clinical training element, which limits the capacity to increase student numbers, I would class that as one of the biggest successes of the demand-driven system, that it did accelerate that at a faster rate than would have been likely under any other system.
Could I add a comment? Because I think the other risk that we carry with the capped environment right now is that the cluster funding is so uneven across the different courses that we may find ourselves in a few years having many fewer STEM graduates because there is it's more efficient to move the places into areas like accounting and law and business. And that won't be spotted until a few years out, and then the minister will wonder why we don't have the STEM graduates, notwithstanding the employment issues. We do need those graduates, and we do need those for the careers of the future. So the cluster funding is also a barrier in a capped environment when you have to just move the money around and get the most from it.
So to explain, the cluster funding is the amount per student that the unis get.
In the most inaccessible seat, Leslie Ann Hawthorne, University of Melbourne. I've got two quick questions. One is, I read some very alarming attrition rates at the period that was the high point of the uncapped enrolments at universities a couple of years back, and I just wondered if there could be some comment regarding that. The other thing is, we're talking so far as if international students are totally decoupled from the domestic workforce. That's absolutely not the case. So if I look at a field like nursing, just taking health as an example, given the previous question, if you looked about 6 years back, a third of the nurses who gained permanent migration status had Australian qualifications. By last year, it was 80%. So there is an absolute feedback loop for many fields of qualification into the domestic workforce. Thank you.
I'll start with the attrition. So it's come back down again now to below what it was when the demand-driven system started. I think there was some learning going on, and part of it was at your institutions. I'll let you talk about that. But some universities moved into completely new fields that they had not done before, or new modes of delivery. And it took some time in some cases to learn how to do it properly. That most of the deterioration or the increase in attrition was actually down to 3 universities rather than the whole sector. And all of them worked out how to improve it after they'd sort of ironed out some. And Swinburne Online was one of those ones. So perhaps you should talk about that.
Thank you. Yeah, if you look at our on-campus students, it was as good or better than the national average in terms of attrition. But because we opened it up very quickly and grew our numbers in our online delivery worldwide has higher attrition. We were meeting the needs of students that were generally older, that were coming back for a further qualification. The majority of them were part-time. We had a higher proportion of people who were Indigenous, a higher proportion with low socioeconomic, regional and rural. So we were at more like 60-65% completions. So that can be a criticism. On the other hand, you've got people who would otherwise never touch a campus now getting some access to education. But what we found was that as we learned about how to engage people more actively in an online environment, keep them motivated, keep them participating, and trialing different approaches in real time, which we could do in an online environment, we actually started to see some real benefits of how to decrease attrition, not only in the online mode, but on the in-campus as well. So I think it was, frankly, a bit of alarmist reaction to a short-term change. but it was about building opportunities for students, and we've been really pleased with how that's improved.
As somebody from VU, of course, I couldn't let the opportunity also go and remark about the success of the block model of teaching units intensively in the way they've been, the way that's been done at VU. And I think what that suggests is that there is scope and capacity for a lot more innovation in delivery, and including, I think, not only between vet and higher education in terms of dual qualifications and those sort of things, but I think if we reconceived the senior secondary years and the early years of tertiary as more as a coherent block of learning for young people to move through, a lot of the issues around attrition that arise because young people find themselves in quite unfamiliar learning in environments, or unsupported, or not having friendship groups, all the reasons why young people often drop out for reasons unrelated to the quality of teaching and learning. And I think if they get a better sense at a younger age about what the whole tertiary experience is going to be, and they get to experience tertiary at a younger age, I mean, let's face it, young people are, we treat the last bit of the architecture of, if you like, the post-compulsory system or the post-15 system that's really unreconstructed is the concept that at the end of 12 years of schooling you have this sharp break with a big capstone assessment to sift and sort people into pathways, rather than actually connecting with the real lives of young people and thinking about the ages, say, of 16 to 19, 16 to 20 as an opportunity for a discrete and intensive period of learning and workplace engagement and so on. And I think from that we would probably deal a lot with attrition rates as well.
I think, we see schools like Templestowe High School now ask young people to plan their futures in year 8 and year 9 and do their 5-year plan and start to explore a whole range of settings, and engaging in different ways of learning that place them in the community, place them in universities, in TAFEs, and expose them a lot more to a range of settings. I think traditionally schools have been very good at keeping young people inside the gates. And so you know when they first join a university campus or they come onto a TAFE campus, you can see who they are really immediately. They just are a bit of a loss of how to function in a place that is not like a school, which can be quite institutionalised. And so schools are working, I think, in recent years to kind of break that up again a bit and expose their students to a range of settings. So you'll often see students visit TAFE campuses and universities. There are programs that are offered by TAFE and universities to school students, both with us going into the schools, but also with young people visiting campuses.
We haven't answered the question on international students. So this is a huge, well, it's not just international students, it's migration more broadly. So I think the numbers we have in our report, about 25% of graduates aged 25 to 34 have either an overseas qualification or are non-citizen holders of an Australian qualification. So I think we want to track some of these numbers in sort of my last few weeks at Grattan, but clearly migration has played as big a role as demand-driven funding in changing the nature of the graduate labour market. And therefore, in thinking about the way the tertiary system needs to work, we need to think about what are the flows coming from outside Australia, as well as the flows coming through the school system and into our tertiary institutions.
Dan Henrahan, the University of Melbourne. The vast majority of people that are designing post-secondary tertiary education policy, like politicians, their staffers, people at the Department of Education, as well as people influencing the debate about the future of work with their guesses of what will happen, have primarily done university degrees, and I would guess not that many of them have done a vet degree, so don't understand it that much, and probably value the university experience they had quite highly. How do you shift, or how do you bring more people that have done a vet degree and experience that into the policy-making discussions and process?
It's absolutely spot on question, absolutely spot on. And certainly in my experience in Victoria and in Queensland, I saw the loss and erosion of people out of the industrial training system, I suppose the continuing rise of the educated professional middle class, the professionalisation of the public service, and so on. I might say it's not only in the public service; it's also in teaching as well. I remember going to one of the technical education centres attached to a high school, where there was an absolutely fantastic Swiss hospitality teacher with a certificate in his 50s, totally committed to the program he was running for hospitality students in the outer east of Melbourne, in an underprivileged area, being told that basically unless he qualified for his degree the following year, he would be out because he wouldn't be able to be a registered teacher. And I think that's part of, so actually rather than looking at what he brought to the learning and the educational environment, the judgment was that he wasn't suitable simply because he didn't have a professional qualification. Well, for somebody at the age of 54 or 55, there was no one in the world who's going to go and do a degree part-time. So I just think we need to rethink the whole concept of the skills and knowledge and capabilities that are required to, as you say, to design and staff and run these the education systems, education bureaucracies, and bring back into the system, particularly in vocational education, a lot of the traditional strengths of the people who used to be there, but I've certainly saw pretty much from the mid-1980s were phased out by the increasing professionalisation through traditional degree requirements of those people. I mean, they either retired or weren't replaced, or in some cases they were just made redundant because they were seen to no longer cut the mustard.
The question around how you get policymakers to be sensitised and understand much more what happens in TAFE institutes. This may sound flippant, but I think, having those people visit and understand what is going on and be exposed to, you see the responsiveness of, and you may not think so, Linda, but you see the responsiveness of policymakers and politicians to chancellors and vice-chancellors. It is in their experience and they understand what they get in a university. When we ask them to be responsive to VET, they're quite sceptical. We're almost interested parties you can't trust, right? Whereas you trust industry and you don't trust the TAFE Institute as the educational provider to be working in the interests of the community and industry which it serves. So there is an issue there in how the sector is seen as a legitimate part of the tertiary sector, how we professionalise the staff that are in that, and that they are rewarded and recognised for the skills they do bring, and that is seen as an important part of the sector. I don't think we have that. VET isn't planned, in a way that you might like to see it planned in the state, in the same way that you might plan secondary schools, So I think those things need to be addressed before we can get any further in the policy space.
We've got time for one more question. Sorry.
I think another example of the cultural problem that the last question related to was that central agencies and treasuries in particular with tertiary educated, and I think I'm actually in favour of well-managed choice and competition in tertiary education, so I'm not anti-market. But to see that turned into a petri dish for market experimentation around the most sort of far-fetched notions of market design and so on, without any regard or thinking through the consequences, and the full protection of the public university sector, in my sense, was no accident. It was basically, well, we can afford to play around with this and do a bit of market experimentation because we don't really care what happens, but we won't do that to the the universities that we graduated from, because we might be frowned on. I mean, that sounds like an extreme statement, but I think it was no accident that most of the people that I worked with in central agencies in particular over that time had no concept of what they were doing or the effect on systems and institutions and students of market design rules, and they were just basically applying the economic textbooks because they never had the practical experience or the on-the-ground understanding of what would happen as a consequence of what they did.
So I've got a short question, then short answers.
Mine will be short as well. Sam Rapisada, Wesley College, Melbourne. I'm in the middle of counselling over 200 Year 12 students at the moment. I'm one of 2 careers counsellors there. Parental expectations, that's my major problem. Is there any way that we can influence parents into understanding that the vet sector is actually a viable option for students?
Pick that up first, yeah, if I could. Look, I think trying to influence parents, I think, is about, if you think about what motivates parents to make choices, it's around future security, income, a better life for their children, than they had. And so they can see what a university has bought in the past and what it potentially could bring for their child. So it's a no-brainer, right, to do that. So I think there's a responsibility for us to be able to demonstrate the possibilities and to go out there and promote some of the outcomes and the way in which successful pathways can be generated through the vet system. I don't think it's as promoted. We don't act as a sector. It's almost, although there's diversity in universities to an extent, they are seen more cohesively as what they offer. Whereas a TAFE institute will offer courses for 3 months, 6 months, a year, 2 years. People will come for short courses. The greater diversity in the pathways are potentially much more complex, and the sense of security in terms of your income and what you get from that is a little bit less predictable for your general person, trying to make those decisions for their young people. So I think we need to be able to promote and be able to demonstrate, more importantly, the outcomes and careers that people have achieved through the TAFE sector.
I think that's a good note on which to conclude the panel discussion. Pass across to John Daly, who's the CEO of Grattan Institute.
If I can just close this evening by doing 2 things. Firstly, to thank those who've made tonight possible. Obviously, the State Library, our continuing partner in this policy pitch series, and to Linda Kristjanson, Peter Noonan and Francis Coppolillo, thank you very, very much for your contribution tonight. Now, as was mentioned a little earlier, this is indeed Andrew's last public event for Grattan, and it's also discussing his last report. And so I thought we should mark the occasion just a little, because the qualities that Andrew has brought and displayed tonight, of course, are the qualities that he's brought to Grattan over so many years. He's very calm, he's measured, he's dispassionate, he's unfailingly polite. And we've seen all of that, despite, frankly, quite a lot of provocation every so often. The Campus Morning Mail recently described him as the ultra-learned Andrew Norton, which I thought, coming from a university publication, was quite a compliment. But of course, it's true. He's deeply analytic. He has an extremely deep knowledge of the sector based on working on higher education and its policy for essentially all of his working life. And that really shows, I think, in the work that he's put out. Because he has brought these qualities to Grattan, as Tim Dodds in the Higher Education Supplement wrote recently. For the past 8 years, anybody interested in Australian higher education policy has come to be highly reliant on the work of Andrew Norton. He's admired for his independence, his insightfulness, his willingness to be provocative, and the fact that his policy work is deeply rooted in evidence. And I think all of that is true. enabled by those qualities, I think Andrew has really left at Grattan and left for the sector an enormous and very important body of work. There is, of course, the 5 editions of Mapping Higher Education, which one university chancellor told me he basically sent to all new council members and told them, asked them politely, please don't turn up to your first council meeting until you have read it cover to cover. I'm not sure whether he in fact administered a test, but I suspect so. There's the work that Andrew has done on university teaching, on online teaching, on the quality of teaching, on student attrition, and looking at how universities could do better. There is the work he has done on university fees, on international student fees, how that intersects with research funding. For those of you kind of deeply steeped in political theory who would have got the joke about Andrew's report, The Cash Nexus, between international students.
Anyone got the joke?
Which I think was a source of great disappointment to Andrew, but at least I got the joke. I did find it kind of quite wonderful that the Carlton's lone classical liberal was the one at Grattan Institute writing a report about the cash nexus, otherwise known as a Marxist term. But it's been fantastic work. And then, of course, there was the work that Andrew has done on the demand-driven system, arguing why it was a good idea. I think he was one of the very first people to really understand how the demand-driven system interacted with the help system and how the sustainability of the help system was key to the sustainability of the demand-driven system. And I think that is something that we've kind of all figured out now, but Andrew certainly got there a long time before the rest of us, and if we'd all listened a little more carefully, then maybe history would be different. So it's an incredibly important set of qualities that Andrew's brought to Grattan, an extraordinary body of work that he has produced. Obviously, that is not lost. The whole point is it is there to kind of help keep guiding the sector for a long time. And I'm very hopeful that Andrew is not going to be lost to the higher education sector. Obviously, he worked in it well before he came to Grattan, and I'm hoping he will continue to be working in it for a very long time. But I would like to ask you tonight to show your appreciation for the extraordinary contribution that Andrew has made to higher education in Australia at Grattan.